The first to go was my sight. When thinking of the experiment in my mind, I was hoping that my sight would be one of the last senses to switch off. I wasn't sure if the drug shut them off in order, or if it was more of a random cycle. It would be temporarily, but prepare for an uncomfortable but potentially interesting experience. I had been fascinated with sensory deprivation for a long time of my life, but a chlorinated pool wouldn't satisfy me. I wanted something that would truly degrade my senses. I had a quiet experimental sedative, one that would use for a complete paralysis of sensation. I wasn't a huge-name scientific researcher, but I was curious, perhaps to an extreme degree. My sight didn't immediately die, but faded out. It appeared as if I was slowly shutting my eyes, still being able to feel myself blink until all I could sense was darkness. Though I expected the thoughts, I began to sympathize to how a blind man would feel at this sort of limitation. It could be different for one who was born with the condition, but feeling my eyelids move across my lifeless eyes was rather haunting. I almost wished my sense of touch would go next. My mind didn't have any images to process, so I began to process my own. I would describe it similar to how, if one closes their eyes, they see faint but recognizable shapes of color, perhaps resembling what was envisioned beforehand. With my vision gone completely, the faint colors made their own shapes, sometimes appearing to be silhouettes of people. I talked to myself to help keep those controlled, as they began to make them feel invaded. The next to go was my hearing, in which my conversations became completely useless. I first thought that my speech was growing weaker, but I realized that the volume of my sounds was fading, just as quick as my vision. When a toot had left me, I heard only a single sound, or at least, I thought of one. There's a familiar god-awful ringing that many have claimed to hear on a regular basis, sometimes for short periods, others for as much as days. This can be an actual ear condition, but given my hearing had dismissed, I was sure that it was something produced by my own thoughts. The ringing intensified, and began to sound inconsistent. At random, short intervals, the ringing would change into what I think would be a loud microphone speech. Then I assumed the next to go was my taste, though since I hadn't recently consumed any food or liquid, I felt a little change. I did lose a feeling inside of my mouth, but this was being drowned out by the illusion being presented by my loss of sound and sight. More figures appeared in the darkness of my vision, and they then appeared to move. Their steps were jagged, and their ligaments contorted, staggering as if they were an abstract painting in motion. The ringing in my ears continued to grow more acute, more concentrated at intervals. The voices in my head were nearly in sync with the movements of the colored shadows, being the most evident when they were closer. As my senses began to feel more hijacked and deprivated, I recognized that my sense of smell was fading low. Like my sense of taste, this passed by me nearly unnoticed. I was too far distracted with what my mind was creating. There was only a single figure left, centered in the darkness. I stepped forward slowly, with the ringing now blaring through my head. My hearing didn't feel gone anymore, but blocked out by the constant noise. I began thrashing at my surroundings, shouting for help that I wouldn't even be able to witness. The shadow was tall, with some limbs wider than the rest of its body. Its legs still waved when it walked, twisting as I began to make out what I thought were eyes. The last sense to go was my touch, and this had proved to be worse to suffer. As I could feel my body growing invisible, I flailed frantically, knocking into objects. I threw myself into the ground and began to scrape my body with my nails and teeth, desperate to feel a sense to my mind. After what felt like only a few seconds, every moment of my senses shutting down, the ringing in my head ceased and turning to soft, unrecognizable whispers. These, like the ringing, grew louder as the figure continued to approach. I could only watch as it came closer, and just as it appeared to be only a few feet in front of me, I saw its face. I saw its eyes. They were black lenses flashing with dim colors and swirling in a vortex. They locked onto me, and as I looked into them, the surrounding darkness became more like the eyes themselves, a chaotic, sickening void with no calm in its storm. The whispering had passed, and it changed into a violent screech. It was comparable to a low-quality, distorted microphone scream blasting on the highest volume. In the midst of the metal suffering, which I was praying would end at any moment, I had the foolish, insane idea of speaking to the nightmare. I asked what it was, and what it wanted. I merely thought of the words, and its screeching ceased, only to begin speaking in the whisper it had made before. This time, I could understand every word. I am what remains when everything else you had vanished. I am what is left, watching you as you are distracted, made blind by everything else you sense and experience. I am what you sometimes witness for a split second, only to pass off as an imagination. I wait patiently, eager for the moment where your soul is left exposed, without a shell to protect you. The whispers made me convinced that my hearing had muted, that somebody in reality was whispering right into my ears. As I continued to look into its being's tormenting eyes, it began to reach its jagged, deformed hand near my face, as if to grasp at it. As I felt my spirit and sanity begin to collapse, the shadow began to dissipate and fall back into the void of that what it was becoming brighter. The whispers and screech fell back quickly. Like my body was waking up from a violent dream, my senses come back all at once. My energy had been massively drained, like I had just ran in circles for hours. I was only lying on the ground in my living room floor, with the objects and furniture in shambles, wrecked from a struggle. My body was covered in bruises and scratches, covered in a thick layer of sweat as I panted from what had gone through my head. My ordeal was over, as the pill was only temporary. I looked at the clock, trying to remember when I had started the experiment. The entire event had only lasted 4 minutes, as the researcher had originally promised. I spent the next hour trying to collect myself, disturbed from what had taken place. Although I seemed safe, I still felt a feeling of dread as I tried to remember everything I experienced. I tried to pass the experience as a fabrication of my mind, that losing all my senses had caused my feeling of paranoia and fear to materialize into a void terror that would only vanish from my senses, though from my senses recovered. What I can't forget, however, was those words. Its words. The distorted being had vanished, but was it because my senses now blocked it out of my mind? I only wished that I could have been too daring to ask the question I had. Had I only kept silent, I would have passed this event off as my intensified imagination, another event horror created, then destroyed by my head. I want to be able to think that, but I can't, because every time it comes to my mind, I can only think of right in front of my face, invisible. Waiting for my body to be dead in my mind, I can only think of the right in front of my face, invisible, waiting for when my body is dead and my mind is the target of havoc. As always, I can see the faint colors when I close my eyes, sometimes shaping themselves in a familiar, distorted figure.